This is the second 6 of not interviews with writers, more conversations, and trying to listen as carefully as I can to what another writer is saying. It's been a tremendous experience for me because I've been deeply moved constantly with each writer by their willingness to try and answer almost anything you ask. Even if there are no definitive answers, the joy has been in the act of almost reaching a solution and an answer to this mystery of writing. Today I'm listening to Louise O'Neill, who's written 4 novels, among them Asking For It and Almost Love. She's a very unusual case. Technically I suppose she's a young writer, but there's something in her work, like in all the really best work and this most sublime work, that's ageless, timeless. She's one of the number of younger writers in Ireland who, for reasons I don't know, somebody else can explain it, come fully formed, fully fledged into the world of writing, and who make books that are astounding and overwhelming in their achievement. As an older writer, or is it an old writer I should say now, I do sometimes, in the privacy of my workroom as I read their work, sit suddenly in awe of what they're doing. There is a magical proponent to the fact that somehow or other I've been allowed by fate to talk to Louise O'Neill. When I was astonishingly and unexpectedly made Laureate for Irish fiction, and I presume I have been writing fiction for 40 years, it seems to be the case. But then I realized that it was part of being a creature of a species that's only been around for 200,000 years, which is quite brief, that I didn't actually know what I was doing exactly. What it might be. Academics and journalism can tell you a sort of version. They'll write a version of what we do. They will intuit what we might be up to. But in academia, when they say O'Neill's purpose in this book, or Barry's purpose, and we know in our heart of hearts that we had no purpose other than survive the strange and sometimes thrilling ordeal of making a book. So it was making me wonder, would anyone else know that does the same thing? And even in not knowing, that might be as good an answer as any. And the question is really, do you ever wonder? We can wonder, we are wondering about the world, that's what we do. So can we also wonder at this strange creature who has this strange impulse? And how ancient is it? And does it help us in any way to think of the previous hominids who may have been driven to the same process, and possibly even a process that allowed us to make this strange and possibly perilous and possibly regrettable advance from whatever we were before those women in Africa to this thing we are now? What do you ever think about that?
Firstly, I love it when academics talk about my work, because they make me sound way more intelligent. God, that's such a... And then I start pretending that was my initial intention and using that in interviews, because it makes me sound incredibly intellectual. That was not the case. It's funny, recently, this is going to be quite a long-winded reply, but recently my father and I went to Newgrange together. We've been planning this trip for ages, and it was an absolutely fascinating day. And we went to you see all these examples of Neolithic. Well, they're not sure if it's art or whether it was an ancient form of language, or whether that's actually telling a story, and we just, I think, are unable to decipher it. And when we were leaving, I think I began to feel quite ignorant, I think, about not just that period of Irish history, but where that sort of lay in relation to, I suppose, global history in a greater context. And I read this book I'm about 10 years behind everyone else with this book, but anyway, it's called Sapiens. I'm not sure if you've read this. It's by, I'm going to probably butcher his name, but Yuval Noah Harari.
Yes.
And I was really struck by this theory that like 70,000 years ago, there was this cognitive revolution and this massive, I suppose, jump in the way that we see humans, and this species called sapiens. They crossed the ocean, they settled in Australia, the first examples of what we would see as art, and they basically obliterated the Neanderthals. And what he sees as, I suppose, the one factor that distinguished them from, let's say, the Neanderthals was fiction, was their ability to create stories about things that don't actually exist, or that we have no proof of in the natural world. So let's say God, myths, legends. And I think there's something really striking about the idea that what makes us human is the ability to tell stories. And I think that's really true.
And it's a leap that created something new, but also something catastrophic. I mean, what strikes me at the age of 64, just even to look at the history of the world in my own lifetime, is that we do have an impulse towards improving and goodness and kindness, but it lives cheek by jowl with that other murderous part of us that wants to seemingly to destroy everything. Even our very surroundings, as if we were anxious somewhere deep in us to erase the theatre where our children or our children's children could live. Is part of the necessity of writing stories then, or telling stories, because writing is such a recent thing, is it to solace our fellow creatures, or is it actually sometimes to discipline them? I mean, I'm thinking of this in particular in relation to your work. Is it a sort of magic, alchemical spell to try and fill it out, that dangerous, pernicious part of ourselves?
I think it can be both. I think it can be both.
That's the curious thing about it, isn't it?
And I mean, when you say, can it be a solace? Yes, and I think it absolutely can. And I think that not just, and I'll come to my own work, but in my own personal experience, when I was a teenager, like we had the internet, but it was, the house computer, this dial-up modem that took, about like 5 hours to get going. So I didn't have...
It made a sound like an animal.
Yes, that kind of screeching sound. That's just... Anyway, you're old when you remember what that sound was
so
like.
Old, Louise,
But I suppose I didn't have access to the information that teenagers today have. So I can't, I couldn't whip out my smartphone and Google, am I normal? But I did have a library card, and I had parents who gave me a very generous book allowance because they thought that was important,
Yeah.
And it was, I think, in the pages of those books that I could find the answers that I was looking for. Like, for example, masturbation was something that girls did not talk about as teenagers, not when I was growing up in a convent all-girls school. And it was with Judy Blume and Deanie and Summer Sisters that I actually was like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one, because it was always seen as this thing that just boys did, and then I suppose when a teacher gave me a copy of The Handmaid's Tale when I was 15, and that book, it was like it took the blinkers off, and it made me understand why I found so many aspects of the world that I was living in problematic, but I didn't have a language with which to articulate myself before I read that book. And I suppose with my own work, I have people who come up to me at readings and who send me, direct messages on social media, or who send me emails, and they want to tell me their stories, particularly I suppose with asking for it and about, sexual violence, or about eating disorders, or about, toxic relationships. And I can see that those books have been a solace to them. I remember after Asking for It came out, I got an email from a woman, and she said that she had been raped 8 years previously. And she said, I've been in therapy, and my therapist says it's not my fault, and my friends tell me it's not my fault, and my parents tell me it's not my fault. And she said, when I put down the book, she said, for the first time in 8 years, I thought maybe it hadn't been. And I mean, that's like, I don't really have the words, I suppose, to express how humbling that is. But I think that is the power, not like, I'm not trying to be grandiose or talking about my own work.
That's your true reward.
Yeah.
Because you've engaged at a forensic level without knowing the person with their very being. So then a book of fiction can be like a secret machine that you transfer to another person's brain in order to, yes, give this tremendous understanding, which then leads to solace. Maybe as we accidentally solace people, we can be careful that we're not taking any easy route to it, because we've had so much bad history in Ireland that I always feel that if you just take on board as much as you can the actual history of your country and of yourself, then there's a moment of enlightenment, and then there's a moment of true freedom. This country, we're always talking about Irish freedom, but what the greatest freedoms seem to me to be personal freedoms, and freedom finally from our own trauma, and feeling that somehow, you know, you've been given a mystical Spencer carbine as a defense in the rest of your life. You know, not that you ever fire it, but it's there. And maybe that's partly what fiction is doing. I mean, I'd find it deeply shocking, actually, that you say that in your convent school there was still no effort made to, because I would associate that with my sister at school in the 60s. But at the same time, Toby, who's 22, my son, I think he was still finding his school, you know, a rural school, unenlightening in regard of what he was, which was this fabulous young gay person.
We didn't have any sex education, like none. Like someone came in when we were...
That's a disgrace though, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, when I was in Leaving Cert, which was 2003, we had someone come in to talk to us about chastity, and that we should stay virgins until we were married.
Was this a man or a woman?
It was a group. They did like little skits. They did like, they kind of acted out skits, of, you know, basically how terrible it was when they had lost their virginity. And it just felt like, firstly, it was a group of 18-year-olds. So
I can't quite believe this.
For 60% of that class, it was too late.
Yes.
You know, it was like, if you'd wanted this conversation, we probably should have had this much younger. But like, there was no mention of, you know, female desire, about homosexuality, about, you know, about trans issues. There was about consent. Like when we talked about consent, it was the age of consent, not about the idea that you could willingly say, yes, I want to do this, or no, I don't want to do this. Sex was sort of something that just happened to you, I think.
In short, there was nothing about freedom.
No.
To gainsay desire, in a way, is an effort to extinguish the most. It's like a fire hydrant used to extinguish the most important part of us. Do you think, in a certain way, the making of stories and fiction is creating a book of maps of desire, of human desire, true desire?
Well, I mean, I think for women, the idea of desire is so complicated because we are rewarded for, I think, controlling our desires. And I think with two of the most primal desires, you know, which is hunger and which is like a sexual appetite. And women have been rewarded for being able to suppress both of those, you know, to keep yourself thin and also to keep yourself sort of chaste. And I think that what I've been trying to do with my work is to try and be really, really honest and show, I suppose, particularly female characters that aren't, you know, I suppose a criticism that is kind of levied at them constantly is this idea of whether they're likable or not. And actually, I'm not really interested in, you know, their likability, but are they real? Are they authentic? And are they able to express their desires in a way that feels honest to me? And if they're not, how can I suppose interrogate the society in which they live, which is not allowing them the freedom and the space to do that? Because I think that's an issue that most young women, will face. And I think it's really helpful to read about that in a book, and because sometimes I think we accept facets of society that have become normalized, and we sort of just think, oh, this is just the way it is. And I think sometimes what's really useful in art is that it sort of holds a mirror up to maybe the more unsavory, parts of the world that we have just accepted, and said, no, this isn't right. You don't have to believe in this. You don't have to accept this. You don't have to normalize this.
Having written Days Without End myself, it created a new world for me where just incredible versions of my son were coming to my readings, with beautiful painted nails and thanking me. And then older gay people who were saying, oh, Sebastian, you have no idea what it's been like, and thanks for writing that book. And it's exactly that thing you're talking about, where you feel that it's not that you feel immense or made greater by this. You just feel recompensed, and sort of strange relief to have managed something, and that you haven't entirely wasted your time.
Yeah. Well, I suppose especially when you're taking on a subject like that, you don't want to, I suppose, inflict further damage or hurt upon people who have been really hurt by society at large. I think there's a sense of responsibility there. I think it's funny. I was a really religious child. I wanted to be a nun for yes, I know. Then I discovered boys and was like, that would be a terrible idea. And I think there was this massive part of me that I really believed in this idea of God and this sense of something greater than I was, that was guiding me and that was protecting me, and that was leading me through my life. And when as a teenager, I think particularly growing up in the Catholic Church, I really began to reject a lot of the ideologies, particularly around abortion and women and and gay rights, and I suppose the sex abuse scandals and how they covered them up. But as an adult, I think I've spent my entire life trying to find something that will give me that sense of comfort that my faith gave me as a child, whether that's in tarot cards or crystals or yoga or meditation. And actually, I think where I find it most frequently, and I suppose most consistently, is when I sit down at my desk, because there's this moment before I start writing when I have no idea what I'm going to say or what's going to come, and I humble myself by asking the universe or whatever is around me to use me as a channel for this book. And in some ways, I think when the writing's going really well, and it's not every day, when you have that moment of you're completely nearly outside of your own body and you've connected to something and it's flowing from you, and you look at it afterwards and you can barely remember writing these particular words.
Louise.
That is a moment of the divine. And that doesn't come every day. I really wish, because the writing would be quicker and I think it would be better, but that moment, I'm like, that's what I've been looking for.
I also think it makes it wonderfully disreputable in a way, because we take all the credit for these books.
You're like, I don't think I've really written this, but okay.
Well, I know for a fact that long swathes. You write the book, you deliver it, you might poke around when you get some notes, but when you have to face the actual task of reading it rather than writing it, when it's in proof, if there aren't long stretches I have no memory writing, then I know it's not going to be very good. Now that's, in a way, a frightening paradox, because it means you have to be sunk so deep into some part of your brain which possibly is connecting up to these enormous distances. I'm so pleased to hear you say that about writing, because I know there are writers, I think, who plot out their books. I'm very interested in plot, but I think, and as opposed to story, but now, having been a modernist child, as you might say, I realize that there is a thing called naturally occurring plot when you're making a book. So a part of that sunkenness and part of that escape, if it is escape, if that's the right word, is that these other things can come into play. And the not knowing, don't you think, Louise, that when you're writing a book, the not knowing what's going on is more important than the wretched things you do know?
Yes. Well, I suppose that's because it's in the subconscious, and I think that's where creativity lies. And I think the act of creativity, the creating something out of nothing, to me is miraculous. And when I sit down in front of my computer and I have no idea how I am going to create a world and fill it with characters and, you know, I suppose carve this story that's going to span.
But you know the time
pages.
has come to start. Now, how do you know that?
It's so difficult to predict, like when is going to be, you know, the right time and when it's all going to come together. And it's like an impulse. And I think it has to build up enough energy,
and then
you know.
when it does start, that first sentence.
Yeah.
How rich do you feel that day?
Yeah. Well, but again, it's looking at that. Well, I try and write, like, I try and sort of say, okay, I'm going to write 1,000 words a day. So when I have that done, and it's this moment of, it's funny because I'm so impatient with everything else in my life, you know, like I want instant results. I want instant gratification. Yeah. And I think one of the greatest things that writing has taught me is patience, is this idea of I cannot do this in a day. I cannot do this in a week. It is going to take time. I have to accept that, and I have to have faith that every word that I'm putting down on this page is going to result in the final product, that a book will be created out of that. And I suppose that is a part of the magic and part of the faith. You have to, I think you just have to trust that if you jump, the net will appear.
And then you have made this thing. And I'm glad we're in private here and no one will ever hear me say this. But I do think for a good book, leaving aside my own efforts, it has this kind of sacred quality in the proper sense of the word. It's like the final word and also the first word, you know, in that Platonic sense. That the bar is high and the stakes are high. This has been, all the podcasts I've done with my fellow writers has been, it's been an enormous privilege, but it's been just a joy just talking to you.